Once upon a time, in the warm and sunny state of mind called California, there was a young graduate student studying decision science in the School of Engineering at Stanford University. And his teachers were giants in the field, people like Ron Howard and Jim March and Amos Tversky, and sometimes visiting giants would come from Berkeley like Barbara Mellers and Danny Kahneman. And they taught this young man how to help people reflect critically on critical decisions. And this young man met a surgical oncologist named Laura Esserman. And she said, "These decision science powers you have, we need more of this kind of thinking in medicine." And I think Brian Leitner's remarks about doctors bore that out pretty well. And so I began to work with Laura Esserman's patients. And the very first patient that I ever worked with was a woman named Mrs. B, who was coming to see Laura with a diagnosis of early-stage breast cancer. Now, I arranged to meet Mrs. B a few minutes before her regularly scheduled clinic appointment. And I sat down with her and helped her reflect critically on her situation. And she was very vocal and open and forthcoming about her goals and concerns and priorities and questions. And then when Laura came in the room as the surgical oncologist, I noticed that Mrs. B froze up and wasn't quite as forthcoming anymore. But Laura presented the diagnosis and the prognosis and some treatment options. And then she presented her treatment recommendation, which was for Mrs. B being a perfect candidate for breast-conserving therapy, which meant that Laura would do a lumpectomy just to remove the tumor. And then Mrs. B would need 6 weeks of radiation to make sure that the rest of the breast didn't have any residual cancer in it. Well, Mrs. B was getting visibly upset at this recommendation. And so Laura sought to reassure her and say, "You know, I understand why this is so upsetting. I do need to tell you that the 10-year survival rate for people in your condition with this treatment is over 95%. And these treatments, while they're invasive, are very well tolerated. The surgery, I'm going to make a small incision. The radiation is very targeted, and it's every day for 6 weeks, but it's just 10 minutes, and there'll be a little fatigue. But really, overall, you're going to do very well, and this will be the definitive treatment." And still, Mrs. B was visibly upset. And I said to Laura, "I think I might have some insight into what's going on here." And I gave Laura the notes that I had typed up and printed out from my earlier conversation with Mrs. B. And what Mrs. B had told me was that other than the cancer, her biggest concern, her major priority, was that her mother's eyesight was failing. And that her whole life, her mother had wanted to go see Europe and the European capitals, and they'd spent the last year planning a cruise to see all these wonderful European capitals. And that ship was literally set to sail in 1 month's time. So I said to Laura, "I think what's going on here is Mrs. B is upset about the treatment schedule and how that's going to interfere with this bucket list trip with her mom. And, you know, it's going to be potentially difficult to reschedule depending on the cruise schedules. And then her mother's eyesight is failing. So there's a real time limit on how to do this." And Laura said, "Oh, I didn't appreciate that." And I said, "Laura, are there any other options? Can we do a little more decision making here?" And she said, "Yeah, as a matter of fact." And she laid out a few more options. And then Mrs. B surprised Laura by choosing the very last option on the list, which was to have a mastectomy, to have the breast entirely removed, which would obviate the need for radiation. And furthermore, Mrs. B wanted to take Laura up on the option to defer the reconstruction, because reconstruction, while it achieves the good cosmetic result you want, that's actually pretty involved and time-consuming, and that would interfere with the plan to go on a cruise. So Mrs. B went off on the cruise and had a wonderful time and came back to pick up her treatment and reconstruction. And Laura, again, said to me, "I told you, we need more of this kind of thinking in healthcare." And I want you to think for a minute and make a note to yourself. We're going to have a Q&A session later. What can you draw as financial advisors and people in the financial services industry from this story about a surgeon counseling a woman with breast cancer? So make a note of that, and I'll continue the story Laura moved to UCSF and then recruited me to follow her there. And we built a program of decision support for patients, really focused on helping patients and doctors reflect critically on critical situations like that of Mrs. B. And we did a lot of research into this patient experience. And in healthcare, the standards are very high for rigorous research in an academic setting. And so that research included randomized controlled trials, and I have 50-plus peer-reviewed publications with primary data on the patient experience reflecting critically on critical decisions with their doctors. And a few years ago, I got a phone call from Kevin Hofberg at Russell Investments. And Kevin was running at the time PCS marketing for Russell, and he said, I've been following your work with doctors and patients, and actually we have exactly the same dynamic between advisors and clients. And you've really cracked the code. He read some of my articles. He said, you've really cracked the code on two advisory superpowers. And the thing about these superpowers is if you get them right, nothing else matters. But if you get them wrong, nothing else matters. So he said these advisory superpowers should be at the core of every advisory firm's client experience. So I'm going to interrupt my story here just to tell you what these superpowers are. I don't want to keep you in suspense. And you might want to jot these down. We'll come back to them. The first superpower is the ability to get people to tell you what they're thinking but not saying. The ability to get people to tell you what they're thinking but not saying. And that means you're getting to the hidden agenda. And I think everyone in this room knows when you're interacting with clients or prospects, the hidden agenda is the real agenda. And then the second superpower is once you've surfaced the real agenda, can you quickly guide people to good decisions in areas where they're stuck? So those two powers, you can call them core competencies, those are really definitional for advisors, because if you don't have the first superpower, which is discovery, you're just working on superficial issues and you're not really adding a lot of value. And if you don't have the second superpower, decision-making, if you find areas where clients are stuck, if you can't get them unstuck, at least get them on a better trajectory. I think Brian referred to this earlier as being the quarterback. You don't have to solve all the problems, but you got to be able to refer people and connect them with resources. Again, if you don't have that second superpower, decision-making, you're basically superficial as an advisor. And what I spent the last 15, 20 years doing was studying the science of discovery and decision-making, because it is a systematic process, which, as we'll see, has tremendous benefits for business outcomes in the spirit of putting the client first. If you're able to demonstrate your trustworthiness as an advisor in discovery and decision-making, that's going to come back to you in many ways in terms of business outcomes as a happy side effect. So Kevin Hofberg, back in Russell, said, I want to introduce you to some of the firms that work with Russell. And he introduced me to a firm called Halbert Hargrove. And Russ Hill, the chairman and CEO, he immediately saw the connection between the work I'd been doing in healthcare and financial services. And he said, let's do a test. And so he had a client that was just joining the firm. And this client was a woman whose husband had always been the CFO spouse and was a do-it-yourselfer. Unfortunately, he had developed Alzheimer's and was in a facility. And so Russ said, our client here is in a vulnerable situation. This is new territory for her. I don't think we fully understand her needs. And in the spirit of being a good fiduciary, why don't you go talk to her, use those superpowers of discovery and decision-making, and let's see what you come back with. So coincidentally, her last name began with B, so I'll refer to her as Mrs. B. Turns out she was the first person I talked to who was a client in financial services. And I got her permission to record the telephone call we had, and I'm going to play you now a 3-minute excerpt of that recording. And what I'd like you to focus on is, what am I doing or not doing as the advisor in here that is enabling or enacting the first superpower of getting someone to tell me what they're thinking but not saying. And then we'll go into what is the science behind this approach and this methodology.
Overall, are you satisfied with the care he's getting and the support you're getting from the facility that he's in?
Yeah, it's a very nice facility. It's close to home. It's just about 10 minutes away.
Mm-hmm.
It's a new facility. The staff is great. They have activities.
Mm-hmm.
Meals are good. They have a lot of extra. The only thing he doesn't like is that he does share a room with another man that's in a wheelchair. He's kind of he just would like to be in a room by himself because he calls his room home.
Mm-hmm.
But
is that?
I don't know if that would really resolve anything or not, because this roommate that's in a wheelchair, he's not in the room much. But he doesn't like people coming in and out of his room. He's very territorial. He's kind of he wants more privacy than what he gets.
Mm-hmm.
And that bothers him. Because they're always coming in with laundry and they, supplies and cleaning the bathrooms and doing this and doing that. And that irritates him.
Yeah. And does the facility have, individual private rooms?
They do. I think you have to sign up for them. There hasn't been any. I think they have 9 in the whole facility. And they really haven't been available, but it's also $1,100 more a month for a private room.
Yeah.
I cannot justify that.
Okay, so while this Mrs. B was talking, I was taking notes, and I produced, as is our custom in my program for in healthcare and medicine, I run a program at the UCSF Medical Center where I have 24 medical interns who conduct this kind of discovery interview with our patients and then type up a discovery note. So we do this with 3,000 patients a year. The program has spread to other medical centers. We've gotten nice recognition in terms of being innovative and patient and family centered. And the work product for this discovery phase is always a one-page, very important that it's a one-page report, which I've got for Mrs. B as a handout in front of you. And the nature of this report is that it's very terse bullet points, not complete sentences, it's not highly formatted, and it's laid out in chronological order. And that's important because what we're trying to get at in discovery is to queue up and tee up the second superpower of decision making. We want to focus, we want to identify areas where patients, or in this case, clients or prospects, are stuck. And in the excerpt I just played for you, Mrs. B was stuck on this issue. One of the issues she was stuck on, and it's reflected in the middle of the page here, was can she afford to put her husband in a private room, which is what she thinks he would like. So when I printed this out and sent it, or I emailed it to the advisory team at Halbert Hargrove, they immediately saw connection points where they could do decision-making with this client. And the first one was on this issue of getting her husband a private room. They did some research and figured out that he's 80 years old with Alzheimer's, the way the disease is going to progress and the way facilities progress, or your accommodations progress. There was really a finite window of time when he would appreciate having this gift of a private room, and that her portfolio and her financial condition was such that they could absolutely help her configure things so that she could get him a private room as a last gift, really, before his health declined further. So this is just an example of putting discovery and decision-making to work in a way that meets the client's needs. And as I mentioned, there is a science to this. And so I want to describe for you now some of the science behind the art of discovery and decision-making. So it all starts with a framework I developed called the iceberg framework. And this is actually very literal. We're used to the iceberg as a metaphor, but clients really are icebergs from a cognitive and behavioral processing point of view. At the tip of the iceberg, there's information and issues that clients are consciously aware of and willing to share with you. And really, there's only a half dozen of these. It's 7 plus or minus 2 issues that people keep in working memory during a conversation. So there's a very finite number of things at the tip of the iceberg. And the way to get to the bottom of the iceberg, which is where we all want to be, is actually to start at the tip. If you try to dive in, Simon Sinek says start with why, which is a great method for introspection. But if you talk to somebody else and you start with why, that can raise defenses. If you're trying to just dive into the iceberg, sometimes you'll get lucky and people will disclose their hidden agenda. But really what the science of discovery is all about is melting the iceberg or thawing the client. And you do that through a theory of progressive disclosure, which is you get them talking about the things they're willing to share and they're comfortable talking about. And we'll talk more about how you make that happen. And then there's the depth of the iceberg, and this is things that are either in conscious awareness, but the client is not willing to share with you yet. Or in some cases, they're not consciously aware of an issue, but it's in kind of pre-conscious awareness. So if you ask the right questions, you can get them to reflect on things that they're not yet aware of. So the science of discovery, there's a lot of variables in this science. It starts with the environment, the context. What kind of location is this conversation taking place in? Is it in person? Is it over the telephone? If it's in person, is it at an office or in a home or over lunch? Who's having the conversation? Let's say on the advisor side, what are the roles of the people that are involved? On the client side, is it a client? Is it a prospect? Is there one or more? Is it a center of influence? What kinds of barriers to disclosure do they have before you can really get to their full iceberg of the real agenda? And when you do have the interaction, what is the content of that interaction? How much is each party talking? How much is the advisor asking questions? And I'm particularly interested in what kind of training and coaching and feedback have advisors had. I've been astonished really in my journeys in healthcare and education and now in financial services at how little systematic training and coaching and feedback there is in these two superpowers of discovery and decision-making, which is hugely surprising because these are the fundamental superpowers that gain trust and through which you ultimately gain business. So I'm happy to have the discussion in the Q&A if I'm wrong about this, but I have not seen great evidence of in the formal, either in healthcare or in financial services, in the formal training programs and certifications and everything like that, in terms of really the science, leveraging the science of discovery and decision-making. So I want to dig in a little bit more to the training. And so I've developed a curriculum, and again, this has been refined over years of randomized controlled trials, and we've studied outcomes. Mainly the outcome we study is how much disclosure do we stimulate in the discovery process, and what is the best way of doing that. We also measure satisfaction and anxiety and distress and decision quality. We measure regret. We see improvements in all these areas. And one of the simplest frameworks we use for discovery is the SELECT process. And so I can give you kind of an overview of it right now. I don't have time to go into too much detail. But Monday morning, you can start putting some of these principles into action. The way you melt the iceberg, the way you get to the bottom of the iceberg is you start off by simply writing down the half dozen issues that a client will share with you at the top of their mind. And you write them down without interrupting, so I call this scribing. This is the S in the SELECT process. And you write them down without interrupting and without answering the questions or addressing them. In the case of Mrs. B, it would be, I would start off by saying, Mrs. B, could you please tell me what have you been thinking about or what notes have you made to yourself as you prepared for this conversation with me? And she might say, well, you know, I've been thinking about my husband in the facility, and I've been thinking about the annuity that we have coming due, and I've been thinking about my daughter. And so I'm writing these things down. I'm saying, okay, I got point number one, I got your husband, point number two, got the annuity, point number three, et cetera. And you do what's called saturating the client. You keep going and you keep pausing and letting them fill the space, or you keep asking them if there's anything else they've been thinking about until they have nothing else. And then you've saturated usually a half dozen issues that are on the top of their mind. And then the way you get them to really leverage that theory of progressive disclosure is you circle back over all of those topics, or at least the ones that are, you know, still vague, and you say, hey, I just want to clarify, let me circle back. The first issue I wrote down was the issue about your husband going to a facility. Can you say more about that? The second issue I wrote down. So it's very systematic. It's a recipe, and it's a protocol that we've studied extensively and demonstrated with evidence that it works. So the third step, the third round in this protocol, once you've circled back, and we call it laddering, because you build a ladder down into the iceberg with your follow-up questions. Now you're ready to bring out the checklist, because you want to get at the breadth of the iceberg, and you want to prompt the client for those issues that are in pre-conscious awareness. So this is where you might have a checklist around, popular one in the industry is form, family, occupation, relationships, money. Brian's got scripts around healthcare. You can prompt for healthcare. There's other checklists. So that's permission for you to do that. And then what you want to do at the end is the fourth step is triage, and that's generate a work product. Mark Twain said, I write so I can see what I think. And one of the great gifts you can give clients or prospects is to write up a one-page report, not just for your CRM system, but send it to them and say, I'd like to get your edits. Did I get you here? And a lot of the times people will be very impressed and also gain insight and clarity into their own situation by reading how you've written up your notes on their situation. So training isn't enough in this or any kind of protocol. You also need coaching and feedback, and I think I can illustrate that with, you know, the standard story I have is around, any of you play golf, right? If you've tried to learn how to play golf, which I'm learning now, my son is really into it, and it's a good way to spend time with him. It's hard. I mean, I'm having a tough time with this. But one of the most powerful pieces of feedback I've had is a video. How many of you have had your golf swing video recorded and gotten feedback on that? All right, so keep your hand raised. That was like half or a third of the room. Keep your hand raised if you've had an interaction with a client, a discovery interview with a client, audio or video recorded, and gotten feedback on that. Okay, so we're getting great coaching and feedback on our golf swing, but those two superpowers that are driving the client experience and our business outcomes, we're not getting, apparently, video or audio feedback recording on that. In the golf arena, you can now upload a clip of your golf swing to Hank Haney, who was Tiger Woods' golf coach when he was winning the 14 majors, and he'll give you 140 characters of feedback, which is obviously priceless coming from someone with that much experience. So this is what I do. After I finished working with Halbert Hargrove for a round of training and feedback with their advisors, I started a mastermind program and invited advisors from around the country to participate. And one of the first advisors who participated was a gentleman named Eric. I've changed the name a little. But Eric was a very, very successful and charismatic advisor. And he had an opportunity to work with a custodian referral, a couple of prospects. And he got permission to record and then transcribe his recording and give it to me as a baseline snapshot. And so one of the things I can do with that kind of information is go through it word for word. And I had actually, it was good fortune as a coach and as a trainer that Eric lost this case. And that was good because nothing focuses the mind like, you know, the light of an oncoming train. So he was bummed out to have lost this case, but it offered a good teaching moment. And so I was able to show him areas for possible improvement and teach him the SELECT method, and then show him a visualization. This is a Belkora interaction graph where I've put on the x-axis, you can see the exchanges. This is where an exchange is when the advisor says something and then the client responds. And so I stacked this on the y-axis, the amount of talk time. And so what we were able to see here was at about the 21st exchange, the client asked, the prospects asked a trap question, which was, well, how do you differentiate your firm from other firms? And this unleashed the fire hose of information from Derek, and he started talking and kept talking. And this is the telling and selling mode that we're all, guilty of getting into. But it resulted in him talking for 84% of the conversation. And so I was able to go over this with Eric and make some changes. And I'm happy to say that the next time he had an opportunity, he was able to implement some of the training, really focus on getting full disclosure, the full iceberg from the clients. It turned out these were lottery winners. And when he went through the select process and really tried to understand what was on their agenda, one of the pieces of feedback he got was, you're the first person, when you're a lottery winner, there's a lot of advice coming your way. And the feedback he got was, you're the first person who really started with asking, what are our concerns and goals and priorities, instead of telling us all the things we needed to avoid and all the things we needed to do. So that conversation went better, and one of the ways I know it went better was from the recording and the transcript and the heat map. And here you can see same amount of time, about 37 minutes, more back and forth exchanges and a lot more talk time from the client. So let me just show you before and after. And as one of my advisors says, you can literally see the icebergs now. The blue is the client agenda, what they're saying, and their disclosure. So he ended up winning the lottery. He got referrals to other lottery winners. He added $40 million in AUM. I can't take credit for the circumstances of all that, but he is generous in giving this work credit for helping him capitalize on this opportunity. And so I just want to wrap up my prepared remarks here by saying, really what the science of trust boils down to is training and feedback in better discovery methods, which stimulates more disclosure by clients and prospects, and which allows you to give better advice because you're getting at the real agenda. And that increases trust, which is a positive feedback loop with when you trust someone, you disclose more to them, you tell them more, which allows you to get to the real agenda even more than that and give even better advice, and ultimately results in better outcomes. At Halbert Hargrove, when we studied it, and I wrote this up in a piece in the Journal of Wealth Management, we increased their enrollment rate during this period that we measured from 22% to 47% in competitive referrals. We've seen increases in retention, in consolidation with one of the custodians. The consolidation rate at Halbert Hargrove went from 26% to 37% in the first year after using Select, and in referrals. So overall, I think this is a logic map showing you the connection and the science between these very soft issues around discovery and trust and decision-making and the experience of the client, putting clients first, and then the business outcomes. And so when Brian and Kevin asked me to come speak about this, I was also happy to tell them, and I mean, they were already aware, that we had another participant in the first round of my mastermind who was a Mariner advisor. And so Matt is going to come up and join me. Ready, Matt? And we're going to have a little fireside chat, and then we'll open up for Q&A.
Hey, Jeff.
Good to see you.
You too.
All right. So, Matt, why don't you introduce yourself or reintroduce yourself to people who might not know you?
Sure. My name is Matthew DeQualo. I work in the Madison, New Jersey office as a senior wealth consultant, and proud to be with Mariner for 7.5 years.
So, Matt, when you joined the Mastermind program, what were some of your goals and motivations?
So I would start off by saying that I was familiar with your work through other people at Mariner and throughout the industry. I had read your book about a year or so ago, and I was very intrigued with your process and approach. So when I found out that there was an opportunity to join the Mastermind, I thought that I could benefit from the coaching and the collaboration with you and with other advisors. So my motivation was to gather more personal information, to connect with people, to build trust, and to ultimately close more business.
Right, and so how did it go?
From a qualitative perspective, it went great. I know that going through the program helped me to connect with people much more easily. It helped me to build more trust. It helped me to gather much more personal information, and in many cases, very personal information. And from a quantitative perspective, we found that we closed more business using the select process. We found that our close rate, or batting average, however you want to think about it, went up significantly. So all positive.
Yeah. Is there a story or like a particular case that stands out that would kind of illustrate the dynamics?
Sure. So when I was going through the program, we were presented an opportunity. Husband and wife, Sheila and Chris, were going to interview us and interview a competitor of ours, a solid competitor that we know very well. Their approach is to do a lot of work up front as part of their sales process. So you and I had spoken about this at the time. And we took a totally different approach when Sheila called me to schedule the meeting. She made a comment to the effect of, let me guess, you want me to send statements and tax return and financial data? And my response was, I don't want you to do any of that. I just want you to watch this short video and read a one-pager about Mariner. And so the short video that I sent was a video that Practice Management created called Setting Expectations for the Discovery Meeting, and along with a one-pager, just front and back, brief overview about Mariner Wealth Advisors. So when they came into the meeting, they watched the video, they read the one-pager, and it allowed us just to go through the select process in the hour or hour and a half that we had with them. So we went through a number of discovery questions, which comes right off of our client experience, the Mariner client experience. And at the end of the, excuse me, let me take a step back. In that meeting, they started to disclose things like they had a child who they were concerned about, leaving an inheritance to. We found out that they had goals that were not aligned. So they turned over, that personal information to us. So the next day, my colleague Dave Hill and I drafted an email highlighting, the salient points of the discussion. Talked about next steps and what the first year of the relationship with Mariner would look like. And ultimately, they decided to work with us. And I think it gets back to your point of us going much deeper than our competitor did. Yeah,
interesting. So you've been doing this work for a while now. It's been a year since we did the mastermind. Does this work beyond just prospects? Like, have you tried that with other audiences or other targets, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have a law firm that we've known for a long time that, quite frankly, we've referred them a lot more work than they've referred us. And I reached out to them and asked them to come in and talk to them, about Mariner and how we can do some things in the future. And they had referred a client to us, several years ago. And I asked the managing partner of the firm, a fellow by the name of Ted, I said, would it be okay if we talk about, our mutual client? He obliged, and I went into the meeting. There were a dozen or so attorneys present. I asked a series of questions of Ted about why he referred that client to us in the past, and just kept laddering and going through a series of questions. Why did you refer this client to Mariner? What was it specifically about Mariner? What led to you, referring us and not somebody else? And it created a great dialogue within the room where Ted's partners and colleagues started asking him questions about that referral and not me. And so, in effect, Ted was selling Mariner and I didn't have to. And certainly there came a point at the end where, I talked about what we've done for that person since they became a client. Yeah. But we got great feedback. We feel optimistic that it'll lead to, some referrals in the new year.
Good. And that was still in the business development realm, which is the hat you wear. You've also been a wealth advisor. And so can you talk a little bit about, and we'll also discuss this I think in the Q&A, but what's the applicability of the select process and this kind of systematic approach to discovery for wealth advisors?
Well, what I would say is that most of these meetings will be myself and a wealth advisor present, and so I actually think that the approach works even better when there are two people in the room asking the questions. We've found that it's helped with retention. We've incorporated into our ongoing work with clients, so we feel like it's helped with retention, it's helped with consolidation of outside assets. And going back to my first example with Sheila and Chris, within 1 month of being a client, they made a referral. Someone in a similar situation worked at another pharmaceutical company that was in our sweet spot. They came in, and at the end of that single meeting, they decided to work with us. So we believe it's helped with consolidation, retention, and referrals.
Fantastic. Well, why don't we open up for questions? I think we probably have our magic cubes and throwers, and so please raise your hand and flag down a cube. The question.
So Matt, how long did it take you to get comfortable with the process and kind of, I don't know if it's quote following a script or not, but following the process? Was it easy? Did it come natural, or did it take work?
That's a great question. I actually think that the process is very natural. I think that instead of having someone come in and interview me and ask questions about me and Mariner and the wealth advisors, this approach, flips the script, and so I think it's very natural to, ask somebody else a series of questions. I will say that, the program went on for, I believe, 8 weeks or so, and I think that at the beginning of the program, I probably had heat maps that looked a lot like the example that Jeff showed before, but then as time went on, I'm sure it looked a lot like the end result. But I also would say, and I forgot to mention it before, that I think this process and approach that Jeff has does, and in my case, I knew that I could benefit from coaching. It has helped me a lot with confidence as well, within the meetings with prospective clients.
Oh, you got it. Yeah, go ahead.
Good to go.
If you could say your name, by the way, so I get
Sure.
to know you all.
I'm Corey Allen with the Manasquan office, and my question is, you talked about hidden agendas. I'm wondering about the client or prospect who comes in and the agenda is very, very obvious, blunt force obvious, and there's really no uncovering that needs to happen of what they are looking for. They're very direct. Perhaps they do not want to be profiled in such a way, at least with the scribing step, for instance. And so I'm just wondering how you deal with a prospect who is somewhat aggressive like that.
Yeah, I can make a comment on that, and then Matt, you can chime in. I mean, I see this in healthcare as well as financial services. There are definitely people who are already willing to share more, and they have actually more than that 7 plus or minus 2 issues. So one way to approach that is to ask them to email you their brain dump, because really what we're doing in the first step of the select process is getting a brain dump. And that starts the process of progressive disclosure, and I promise you there is an iceberg under there. It's just there may also be a bunch of stuff that they're willing to share at the tip of the iceberg. Sometimes I see this when I'm working with advisors in terms of there are people who present as being totally focused on performance, and they have, they're engineers or they're oriented that way, and they're totally, and so if you can absorb all that energy and get it in advance, then you can start scribing beyond that. You can ask them questions like, what's the money for? And get them talking about that, and then start to ladder that into the iceberg. And you will get to the hidden agenda and the real agenda. And frequently the advisors that I work with are surprised because they had painted the picture of somebody who was totally performance-oriented, and yet they find there is a holistic set of needs, and there's an incredible bond, even a stronger bond with that person who comes in appearing to be performance-oriented. When you do get to the bottom of the iceberg, there's actually an even stronger bond. So I think there's hope, for getting to the hidden agenda. You might have to be adaptable about how you do it. Matt, was that your experience? Or?
Yeah, and I would say one of the first questions that you encourage me to ask of people is what are their notes and thoughts coming into the meeting, and I think that's where you get a lot of those superficial, I think is the way you put it, topics. And the best way to address it is to write it down and say we'll come back to this later. And I find that, as you're going along, there may not even be a need to come back to it. But every situation's different, but it may be something that could be answered, very quickly at the end of the conversation.
I had a question in the discovery process. I'm Mike O'Neill. In the discovery process, maybe to add on to what you were just talking about, did you find yourself using a different type of language to come up with the questions that you're trying to probe than what you were doing before?
I would say yes. Again, through Jeff's work and the discovery set of questions that are on the Mariner client experience, which is great, was actually developed with Jeff's work in mind. I found out, there's a video on the client experience that actually references Jeff, but I have found that not just the line of questioning, but the process and just certain, techniques that Jeff talks about. One of the things that he really was very helpful with was filling the dead air and not feeling the need to fill the dead air. And so that's something that was very powerful for me where, when there's an uncomfortable silence, I would jump in and say something. Now, I don't say anything and I just wait for them to finish the thought. And it's a little strange the first couple times you do it because you're just sort of staring at each other, not saying anything, but they ultimately will start to say something like, oh, I forgot about this or that. And so I just think that the whole process, the line of questioning, but again, the questions that we have on the Mariner client experience, the discovery questions are very similar to Jeff's, and I think that you can use them both, in conjunction.
A quick question, Patrick Richter from Cincinnati. Do you find, let's say you've had a client for 5 years and you want to start trying to ask some of these questions, is it a different approach without saying, I probably should have asked you this 5 years ago when you became a client, but I'm going to ask you now?
So I can speak to that, and then Matt, because I've seen this quite a bit with other firms that I've worked with. Yeah, that's essentially rediscovery, and the motivation and justification is everyone's life is a journey, and so you never cross the same stream twice. So when I work with other advisors who want to start doing discovery with existing clients, they just present it as, hey, I'd like to check in and get a 360-degree picture of what's going on. And then they'll typically start the conversation. I really encourage people to always start the conversation describing with, so, what notes have you made to yourself thinking about this meeting we're having as you prepared for it, as you thought about it? And that just gives you the wedge to the on-ramp to get started. And then the whole iceberg unfolds. It's your job to, like Michelangelo, the sculpture is in there. And your job, in a lot of ways, is to get out of the way and let people tell you the story. And so not filling the dead air, other techniques that we work on is really important for that. I should say also creating a work document, a work product is really important. So many advisors take kind of sparse notes that end up in the CRM system, but feeding that back as a work product is well valued by the clients and prospects. So in either case, and then really your work has just started because you've teed up areas where they're stuck, and that's where you get to prove your mettle as an advisor, is being that quarterback, as Brian was saying, for I'm going to connect you with resources in whatever areas you're stuck. Sometimes advisors worry, they're like, I'm not a therapist, what if I surface all kinds of stuff that I don't know how to deal with? Well, you better have some therapists in your referral book because there's an incredibly high incidence of depression and mental health issues, and that's absolutely something that you can be a resource for. I got lots of stories about this, but I want to give Matt a chance to comment on the question too.
I would just say that when you have ongoing meetings with clients, it's okay to take certain questions and adapt them, to the situation. They don't have to be exactly, what Jeff, recommends, but it could just be things like, tell us about, what's gone on since the last time we saw you or the last time we've talked to you. I think going back to the consolidation point, sometimes we work with people that maybe have assets that, aren't with us and, maybe in a 401k or with another advisor. And so we just ask certain questions of, tell us a little bit about, what that advisor is doing for you, and just keep laddering along those lines. But I think that in the ongoing, meetings, it's best just to ask a couple of, high-level questions and then let them tell you, like Jeff says, and drill down from there. Can you say that again, Pat? I'm sorry.
Would you recommend having an entirely separate meeting dedicated to this with existing clients, or incorporating it as part of a normal?
No, incorporating it into a normal meeting, but I would recommend doing it, at the beginning of the meeting. Again, unless you think otherwise.
Well, you can do either. I've worked with advisors who've done consolidation campaigns and referral campaigns where they, they set up a whole series of meetings with existing clients with this express purpose of let's get the whole iceberg out, see where we can solve problems. The main orientation I have, similar to what I think I saw Mike and others, Bruce, presenting in the referral session downstairs a few minutes ago, was advisors need to be problem solvers, and you earn things like referrals and consolidation by earning trust and by demonstrating your competence as an advisor. And so you got to tee all that up. You got to get all that opportunity out of the iceberg and out in the open where you can deal with it. And then that's how consolidation and referrals happen more organically, as opposed to, if you simply ask the client for a referral, you're asking for a favor, and you might get some through reciprocity, but it's a much better dynamic for you to be positioning the client in a situation where they see you as a problem solver and they want to help spread your solutions from a referral point of view.
Just want to catch the mic here. When you have clients that maybe insist on, they've got a set, specific questions that they wanted to ask during the meeting, and you're asking your questions and trying to listen to their answers, and maybe they're kind of trying to flip that script back. Is there, I think you use the kind of tell more, sell more, and how do you avoid that? Is it just well, we can come back to that later? You don't want to dismiss or ignore, obviously, their questions. So what are your thoughts or comments on kind of how to kind of flip that switch back, I guess?
Yeah, that's a normal dynamic for clients to want to be, or prospects to want to be interviewing you. What I've found is that you can contract for that in terms of expectations. And you can set up, if you're dealing with a prospect, you can say, hey, look, we'd like to do this following our process in a series of 2 meetings. And one of them or both of them can be on the telephone for maximum convenience. I've also done research that shows that the telephone is actually associated with more disclosure. So we can get into more of that. But if you set up that expectation, we're going to have 2 meetings. The first one is going to be discovery, and I'm going to really use that time to understand your needs. It's going to be a needs assessment. And then we'll have a second meeting where we have a conversation about how our firm can or cannot address your needs. And if we can't, we'll make a referral or an introduction. And if we can, we'll spell out kind of a game plan for how we would do that. And so it's really about not just being reactive to the client, but having pre-structured it for success. Yeah, that's my recommendation.
And I would just say that what I would typically do is write those questions down, try and come back to them later on, or incorporate it into the line of questioning that I would ask of the person. But I think that, again, interviewing them and not having them interview us has been a much better process. Any other questions?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to, it's just a quick one. Matt, you mentioned reading the book. Just like to find out where we can get our hands on that.
Sure, yeah. So the book is called Deal, and it's on Amazon. If you look up Jeff Belkora, Deal, it's there. Also, if you hit this URL, was on the screen. Let me try to get it back on there. Let me see here. If you sign up here, I'll send you, I have an autoresponder set up to send you these slides and a copy of my Journal of Wealth Management article, and also give you the link to the book. So any of you who want any of those things, we'll leave that up. Guidesmith is the consulting company that I've formed around this. I'm still half-time at UCSF, still doing very stimulating work in healthcare, but it's been a real pleasure to translate that work into financial services, and I'm looking forward to more. I think we're down to 0, so I'm here for the rest of the conference, and I welcome conversations over meals and breaks. And I want to say special thanks to Matt for coming up and kind of giving you the reality check on what this is like as a Mariner advisor or business developer. So thanks, Matt, and see you soon.